Climate change is a process that we have set in motion. It has its own inertia and will continue to change by itself without significant intervention. These changes are fundamentally reshaping weather patterns in ways that substantially damage our ability to feed ourselves. This is how we should understand climate change. Not as a simple warming up that makes dangerous heat waves and other environmental disasters like floods and storms more common, but as a feedback loop that we have started, which in the absence of far-reaching, highly coordinated and urgent action that goes beyond net zero emissions, proceeds inevitably towards the total degradation of our habitat. And crucially, we are rapidly approaching a threshold where this feedback loop becomes unstoppable, where we become unable to resist climate change's inertia and the radical shrinking of our habitat is locked in. This is why climate change is not a problem for 2050, the year most net zero targets are set for. It is an immediate social crisis that will define the next 2 decades, and it is within these 2 decades that we will either cross that point of no return or not. Just as the effects of wealth inequality remain largely unknown, the actual dynamics of this habitat degradation are not widely understood. Getting to net zero will not stop warming. Legally, the definition of net zero emissions is that the amount of carbon sequestered equals the amount of carbon dioxide emitted in a given period of time. As such, reaching net zero means that we have stopped increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide, but we have yet to begin decreasing it. However, what has to be understood is that there is a lag between an increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide and warming. One of the reasons for this is that water takes longer to heat up than air or land. If you put a pot in a hob, if you put a pot on your hob, why can't I say that? Why is it like a tongue twister? If you put a pot on your hob, turn the heat up, and put your finger on the base of the pot, it will be a few seconds before you have to pull your finger away. Put some water in the pot, and you can keep your finger there much longer. In the same way, it takes a while for the oceans to warm up after you increase the amount of heat trapped by your atmosphere. Because the oceans have a high heat capacity, they are, on the whole, colder than the air, and therefore tend to absorb heat, cooling surrounding areas down. This is why we gravitate towards the sea in hot weather, taking a dip in the ocean to cool down. The oceans then function as a heat sink that help to set the average surface temperature for the planet. When the oceans heat up, everything heats up, and there's a lag between rises in the concentration of greenhouse gases and this warming. As a result, reaching net zero, which will not reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases, will not stop warming. And all warming sets off feedback loops, which lead to further warming. The hotter the average surface temperature is, the greater the chance of wildfires, which release carbon dioxide and reduce the size of forests, reducing the amount of carbon that can be sequestered. Other major carbon sinks, like soils and the ocean, are also diminished as climate change progresses. Warmer soils speed up the rate the matter is decomposed by microorganisms, turning more carbon into CO2 instead of storing it. Oceans directly absorb CO2, becoming more acidic and altering their chemistry so that they absorb less CO2, leaving more of it in the air. Similarly, as average surface temperatures increase, glaciers and ice sheets begin to melt, revealing the darker layers of ice, which, like a black shirt, absorb and emit more heat, leading to further ice loss and increases in average surface temperature. Finally, portions of this melting ice will be methane sequestering permafrost, which will begin to release methane, a far worse greenhouse gas than CO2, which further increases temperatures. Clearly then, not only is the objective of net zero deeply flawed, but any significant delay in achieving net zero on the path to net negative emissions, i.e. consistently reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases, pushes us closer to reaching a point when all of these processes become unstoppable. When, for instance, ice sheets are so dark that the pace of their melting accelerates beyond management and they enter a phase of self-sustaining terminal collapse. Or when major forests like the Amazon rainforest have been reduced to the point where they permanently lose their ability to reproduce themselves, wiping out our ability to sequester carbon and therefore our ability to prevent further warming. Or finally, when permafrost begins to release so much methane that the temperature rises continue to melt all of the remaining permafrost in an unstoppable feedback loop. The climate change that these processes produce radically damages our ability to grow food. The conditions for growing food or raising livestock are not simple and not abundant. They require a quite unique convergence of temperatures, soil quality, and rainfall patterns. If we lose the ice caps, for instance, we lose the significant temperature difference between the equator and the poles that drives the jet streams which keep weather systems moving relatively quickly over the breadbasket regions of the world, alternating rainfall with sunshine over the most fertile soils. As a result, the jet streams slow, extending the duration of weather systems, drowning crops and then drying them out. But if these floods and droughts don't kill the harvests, the heat will. All it takes is high temperatures during short, crucial periods in the growth of crops to irrevocably damage their growth. It does not need to be hot all the time. But if heat doesn't kill the harvests, it will kill the harvesters. I'll leave a link in the description to a peer-reviewed article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences called Future of the Human Climate Niche. It lays out a theory of the climate conditions for human settlement by looking at modern and historical population centres and cross-referencing them for data on precipitation, average temperatures, soil fertility, biodiversity. What they found was that there was a pretty narrow range of places in which the vast majority of humans have lived, most of which fall within a pretty narrow range of climate conditions. This is understandable not just because it determines the physical viability of growing crops, but also whether or not people can withstand being outside for the lengths of time required to harvest those crops. The researchers predict, on the basis of conservative estimates of future warming, that between 1 and 3 billion people will be living in places outside of that viable climate niche within the next 50 years. But such predictions often do not have space to mention that by reaching those projected temperatures that force mass displacement, it is highly likely that we will therefore cross the threshold to runaway change, such that even more people will find themselves displaced beyond their window of prediction. Nevertheless, it must be reiterated that climate change amounts to a fundamental derangement of the conditions that have sustained human societies of the sort of scale and level of development that we can recognise. Of course, there is no preventing all of this change, and we will have to think seriously about how our agricultural system can adapt. But no one with significant power is doing this thinking, and climate action is reduced to installing wind farms and solar panels. If we are to avoid large-scale habitat loss for ourselves, we have to face the reality of climate change as a feedback loop that gets harder to stop and more destructive of our food systems every year. And I have a big piece on this. Sorry, it's a bit of a bleak one, but it's not actually that bleak. But I understand that some people might think it is, but it's not. Okay, promise. But I go into like lots of the details, right, on my Substack. I hate having to say that, but you got to make a living, huh? Currently, I'm not charging anything because no one's reading it. So maybe if you start reading it, I'll make you pay. Which I shouldn't say because then you won't read it. Bit of a catch-22. Which is actually one of my favourite books. I actually haven't read it. I do have a story to tell about it though, which you can hear on my podcast. I think I actually did tell that story about someone at work who was being really weird about that book. So if you want to hear me talk about, I don't know if I actually said that. Maybe I will say it one day. This has given me the idea to say it. I'll write that down. So you listen into the future. Maybe next week's episode be an exciting story about someone I worked with from someone you don't care about. Don't you want to listen to that? Someone you have no interest in telling a story about their life. Podcast. The Substack, by the way, at Friendly Society. I'll give it time to be on the screen. At Friendly Society, just like the name of this channel, actually. It's like and subscribe. But if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to like and subscribe to Friendly Society at YouTube or become a subscriber for free at Substack, at Friendly Society. You can listen to my podcast, which is called Friendly Pod. You can find it on Spotify. Only on Spotify. Spotify exclusive. I'm like Joe Rogan. I'm exactly like Joe Rogan. I actually am. So please, if you really like Joe Rogan, you'll like me. Definitely. Or in a few years, I'll be Joe Rogan. If you catch my drift. Maybe not even in a few years. Maybe even in a year. That's how bad it's getting. So yeah, the Friendly Pod on Spotify, Substack at Friendly Society.